My name is Gregoire Pam Dick, and I'm the author of Metaphysical Licks. So this notion of a lick as a short sort of phrase or solo in music that became interesting to me as both a formal device for structuring certain sections of the book, that there would be these very short passages that would be like just a little moment that you might have in music. Say a lick is also, it's very associated with jazz and improvisation, so there's an improvisational aspect, and that's a big part of my writing. I'm very interested in that aspect of writing as a kind of in the moment improvisation, and the sort of momentum that's generated through that, and that sort of having to bring everything in that moment and really perform in that way. So I was interested in that. And then the notion of a metaphysical lick was the idea of, well, there's several ideas really. Doing a philosophy that in a non-systematic way, so you're not sort of creating a large systematic structure out of your philosophy, but that it would come in these kind of instants, in these moments where there might be a moment of insight, and then that might lead you to something else. But again, that you could actually have improvisation be a part of your philosophical thinking, and that's rather counterintuitive because people tend to think of philosophy as sort of very organized and controlled and restrained, and then there's logic, and you're sort of working everything out according to various rules. And well, what happens if you approach philosophizing in this other way, where it's almost a musical mode of philosophizing? And then to flip it the other way, can you think about, if you're thinking about philosophizing as a type of music making, then can you think about music making as a type of philosophizing, so that music itself can somehow convey certain philosophical or metaphysical ideas? And this was something that actually came up in Schopenhauer's work, for example, and in Wagner, who is very involved in Schopenhauer's philosophy. And there's a reference, of course, to Wagner in the book, because there's this whole extended riff on his Tristan und Isolde. So this notion of, when you're in an arena, in a realm without words, can that express, rather than stating explicitly, but can that express and raise and touch on various philosophical or metaphysical impulses or ideas? Or so that got me interested in putting those two terms together. Late 19th, early 20th century Austrian Georg Trakl was a poet, characterized often as an expressionist, Austrian expressionist poet. Very strong, striking imagery, disturbing imagery. His work has a lot of repetition in it. It's obsessively narrow, really, in terms of the terminology, and it's a fascinating thing to trace out. So there are these motifs that just recur over and over through the duration of his work. Heightened use of color terms, as I say, a focus on sound. His own life, and Greta's life, they were troubled in similar ways. They both struggle with drug addiction throughout their short lives. They both struggled with their moods. Trakl committed suicide when he was 27, at the front, in the military, in the war. And Greta committed suicide 3 years later, really right around the same time of year. Also having struggled, they both had financial struggles. They had sort of, it was personally difficult lives, and they were very, very close. They had this very intimate relationship, and it's not really known. There's definitely a sort of an incest motif in Trakl's work, and there's debate about, did they have an incestuous relationship or not? How far did it go? And there's sort of, there are letters between them that have been suppressed. So, I guess people aren't sure, but I mean, I was interested in, in a way, it doesn't really matter exactly how far they went. Like, there's an emotional sort of incest there, regardless of exactly how far it goes. So that is thematized in the book as well. Greta's own work, like, I don't know that work. She apparently was an incredibly talented pianist, like a child prodigy. And so that's in there. And then Georg's writing, we do have, I mean, he was very prolific given his short life. He struggled with various types of jobs. He was trained to be a pharmacist, so he was doing that for a while, but he had trouble hanging on to jobs. And Greta, she was married, but then ended up separating from her husband near the end of her life. And of course, as a woman in that time period, that raised sorts of problems because what was she going to do now and how would she support herself? So she really came on hard times financially. As I say, Trakl was helped by this this donation, basically, of Wittgenstein's money, which is what first led Wittgenstein to know about Trakl also. I mean, and then, so they were... their family started out well off enough. They didn't grow up in poverty, but then the father died, and there were just various monetary issues that came up. So, yeah. Well, I first learned about Georg Trakl actually because I had done a lot of work on Wittgenstein, and Wittgenstein and Trakl had this strange connection where they almost met at one point. Really a few days before Trakl actually committed suicide. They almost met. They were both in the military. And so Wittgenstein also, he inherited a lot of money, and he gave his money to someone in the literary community to give to support various poets. And he said, you choose who it is. So this person picked Rilke, among other people, and Trakl was another person. So I heard about Trakl through reading about Wittgenstein, and then I started reading Trakl, and I was just really moved and stunned by his work, and I got very interested in that. And then as I started reading his work, this motif of the sister comes up in his poems, and then I started reading about Trakl and found he actually had a sister, and she was a musician, a pianist, and a composer. And I got very interested in her. There's much less information about her. It's harder to find out about her life. But so then I was reading Trakl's poetry and reading about his life, and then trying to find out information about her at the same time. And then I got interested in that, and I was interested. There's such a strong musicality in Trakl's own writing, and he's this figure of the sister that comes in his poems. She's often playing the piano. There's a reference to sonatas, and so in addition to that explicit reference to music, there's also his own attention to the sonic aspects of writing poetry is very apparent. And so I became interested in that as well, in that kind of musicality. So it all sort of fused together in that way. But the initial impetus was actually coming from my involvement with Wittgenstein. Well, it is primarily engaging with, above all, the work of Nietzsche. So Nietzsche comes in as this fiancé and then husband figure for Greta in the book. And then also Wittgenstein, who is one of the brothers, becomes one of her brothers in the book, particularly early Wittgenstein. So that's in there, and Schopenhauer, Kant. There is some passing reference to some terminology and issues as they are raised in analytic or Anglo-American philosophy. That's my own background. That is my own training. So I'm conversant in that. And so there are ideas that come up, that there's a vocabulary that some of which might come out of, analytic philosophy. I mean, there's, talking about denotation versus connotation, or conceptual role semantics versus truth conditional semantics. There's some riffing on some work of Donald Davidson's, just titles and things like that. Sense and reference, which come up, that comes out of Frege, Gottlob Frege's work, but that was really taken up by the Anglo-American and analytic traditions. So that's in there. Wittgenstein himself is sort of a bridge figure. You can hear, he had an early involvement with Schopenhauer's work, but he also then came up in a context where he was interacting with Bertrand Russell and Frege, and so is kind of there at a very important point in the analytic tradition, and started out very engaged with logic, logical analysis, and sort of theory building. And then his work really changed over time. But he's kind of a bridge figure, so even the fact that there's some reference to his work leads naturally to there being also some reference to these other analytic figures. But one thing I'm really interested in doing in the book is, as I say, approaching philosophy in a sort of anti-systematic and not, anti-professional manner. And so the fact that it's Greta, my version of Georg's sister who's doing this, she's not a trained philosopher. So it gives me license to do philosophy in a freer way where I have this background, I can construct these arguments, I'm trained in this logic, but I can actually step away from all that and do it in this other manner because I'm doing it through the persona of someone who is not doing it, who is a musician instead. So there's, I would say, a glancing reference to analytic and Anglo-American work, but also and even an explicitly expressed relief at not really engaging with the topics in the way they are engaged with in that sector of the philosophical community. Yeah, well, there's all. I mean, again, part of the endeavor of the book is, and this was true in Delinquent, my first book as well, is this attempt to not separate off philosophical thinking and a philosophical mode of moving through the world and perceiving the world from other modes. So they're really interwoven, and there's definitely an emphasis on it's an individual human being who is doing the philosophizing, and it's folded into poetic concerns, what it is to have a body, how you are in the world, musical issues, aesthetic issues. They're mixed. So although there are these separate notebook sections which focus more on the philosophy, in fact, as the book progresses, that distinction really gets broken down, and you really see that these things, I mean, really from the beginning, you get the sense that these things are kind of folded in together. And then the punk ethos is sort of, I mean, it's almost like it's a sort of DIY philosophizing that's going on, and a rebelliousness of, for example, in analytic Anglo-American philosophy, there's this notion of we can't ask certain questions or we can't use certain terms because the terms are vague and the questions are big, and it just leads to a whole bunch of nonsense and gassing off. So we're going to frame our questions very tightly, and we're going to be sort of rigorous in terms of constraining ourselves, and that will prevent us from basically saying nothing, right? And then there's this rebellious, well, I want to take up those big questions that we're not supposed to take up, and I want to move through those. And I mean, when I say I'm speaking on the part of the character. And, still, in fact, there can be depth and rigor, but it's a different kind of rigor. It's not a rigor that relies on certain logical techniques or being systematic. There's another kind of rigor that has to do with probing, going more deeply into these questions and refusing to be satisfied with whatever your current answer is and moving forward. And so I think that you can do this DIY sort of improvisational, non-academic style of philosophizing, and it can still be something that is meaningful and profound, and not just a bunch of gassing off. So I hope. The musicality of Georg's own writing is in there. Greta's involvement with music as a pianist and a composer, and then she ultimately dropped out. She sort of just quit that whole endeavor. So as her life went downhill, and so that's in there. And then there's specific types of music, 12-tone serialism I reference there, atonalism, Wagner's sort of the chromatic aspects of what Wagner was doing. And then there's a lot of references also to punk, to do kind of, late 70s types of things. And then even music that's going on now as well. So again, it's sort of like unholy alliance of, sort of high music and popular music, feeding in together. And I do think that's an important part of the book. And for myself, also attempting to, in the writing of the book, following Trakl, really pay attention to the sounds of words and have sections where I'm really moving through partly on the basis of sound, not just on the basis of the meanings of the terms. And so really highlighting that, that's in there. And the librettos, as with the notebooks, there are there's a sort of a question raised of, well, is it all one gray notebook, or are there, 25 gray notebooks, because it gets a new title every time. So there, similarly with the libretto, it's effectively one libretto in the sense that it is just following along and riffing on this Tristan and Isolde libretto by Wagner. So that's in there. But each section, again, gets its own title because each one is sort of a different version of that. So it's both, you use the multiple, like there are librettos. So yes, in one sense it's one libretto, in the one sense it's many librettos in one. And then, of course, that just obliquely touches on that one of the, classic questions in philosophy, which is this relation between the one and the many. So that's, in there as well. I became interested in this idea of incest and what could you do with that as kind of a structure or a metaphor to expand it out from the biographical setting and this issue of, their actual relationship, to move it out of that. One thing I'm really interested in is engaging with other texts. And so it became a motif of how do you engage this general idea of engaging with inappropriate contact with a sibling text. That's what I call it. So basically the idea is, as a writer, you find another writer, you find a text, a book, whatever, that you respond to very strongly. There's already many natural affinities between the works, and then you engage with that writing in a kind of a perhaps slightly transgressive way, where you're really getting in there with the language. You might be doing some transpositions of the writing. You might, imagine yourself into the persona of that writer. So there's a notion of sort of crossing a boundary or a limit in how you engage with other texts as a writer. And of course, this is, a lot of people are doing this now, sort of engaging in the notion of translation, but in very creative ways and sorts of rebellious ways, where they're really transposing it, what I would call a transposition, transformation somehow. So, but this notion of that there's already a strong affinity there. So that's where the sibling idea comes in, and then you take it even further by letting yourself get in there and sort of like make out, as I call it, some making out and off with somebody else's text. So you're both in there having that sort of deliciously charged relation to another text, and then sort of lifting various parts of it if you want to do that. So there's that. And then in the book itself was this notion of, well, could you have an incest metaphysics or an incest sort of like could you have a kind of an inappropriate contact, arguably inappropriate, traditionally considered inappropriate contact between philosophy and poetry, say, within philosophy itself, between the self and the world, or I and world, if you take the incest structure, the incest motif, and use that to understand the relation between the I and the world, or between language and the world, would that be helpful in some way? So sort of seeing where it takes you in that way. I am very interested in the idea of that really what moves us and amazes us and compels us about philosophy is often less the argumentation that's provided and more the force, the power of certain ideas that come up. And that's where the originality of the philosopher really, really shows up, and often really exceeds the arguments that are in support of these ideas. So this idea of taking this brand new idea of incest, well, what if you bring incest into the philosophical area? Would that, could that lead you into places that you haven't gone to before? So I'm going to read a few short sections from the end of part 1 of Metaphysical Licks, and then a couple of short sections from the beginning of part 2. There's 2 parts to the book, and so that should give a sense of the range. Shatterproof, Gray Notebook Manqué. It's been too long to remember how to tongue kiss. She would like to sleep now for a fairy tale. Wide face, small blue eyes, pouty mouth, rapacious nostrils, sibling doubles. Georg will be played by Peter Sarsgaard, Greta by Kate Winslet. No, by Kristen Stewart with dyed dirty blonde hair, Twilight reboot. Dirty blondes have more pain. Also, she looks slightly like me. But isn't Peter too old for her? Ryan Gosling or Dane DeHaan, then. Either way, girl gets the stronger chin. Forget that all these actors are prettier than the real Trakls. But that last exclamation point was false. It's to fill the mouth in the brow in the mouth. You could swallow one at a time, every moment re-choose it because of horror. Georg's friends heralded his weird poems, while her dissonances did not get heard. Poor grammar. To swallow this draft is to commit suicide. Stillness hovered over the book as a good. Two patterns clashed, created sexual tension. Brother and sister in a tent in the backyard, or playing handball in front of the building. Extremism of Greta's metaphysics expressed in chromatic power chords beyond the Tristan chord. How far should this go? Connection between blurred vision and sharper hearing, but the ringing drowns out everything. Something drugged things. Warping of the LP on the turntable. Truth needle, and the beauty of sleeping for a longer time as through puberty. Many people bring their pawns here, only Greta's is the immature idea of Narcissus metaphysics, instrumental solipsism. The world is my performance, my interpretation. Ergo, something is the score? Knowing the score versus being scored, and scoring versus scoring, take it to the limit, like she slow danced to the Eagles or Bread. With the camp counselor, Lee, dark gold, long hair, gentle voice, jutting hip bones, you are very mature for your age. Then did nothing. A field of shattered, dying soldiers is completely different. Still, she wanted to die because it wanted to. The suffering persisting, no consolation of expression of the age, its character, no such grandiosity. But sight reading or scoring the whole world for yourself is truly selfish. This informal proof has no line numbers or inference rules, yet these notes reverberate, which was to be devastated. Sight and sound. On Richard Wagner's ring finger, skull or star or skulk or stare in a Trakl opera, I said, "Brother, can't we write one?" But my brother was precocious, left her grasping at thin airs. Expressionist like white of eyes or face or an icy mountain, Albanberg and plaintive song, singed or broken. The notes defy the keys, so there still is mystery of must that's unforeseeable. Trakl/Amsel, he is his poem, and Gretel walked in the high wood. Then Marcus gave a freebie with frisbee, scratched the liquid surface of their faces' book, while backlit the sibling shunned it. Fused, it sounds fugal, seeks the fugitive, escapes by sound wave, slapped the drink down the ink, clicked into places like face down in the forced field of conscription's inscription. Encryption or in a crypt. But the matte pics of the death stone stayed black, bordered, inscrutable, overexposed or post. Psst, whispered this, but she didn't hear. Sudden death. Because cold or fled, the strands of things hit flying. Light turned to a turnstile. My big brother Georg murmured, put the German quote here, ein Toter besucht dich, auch dem Herzen rinnt das selbstvergossene Blut, und in schwarzer Brauen nistet unsäglicher Augenblick, dunkle Bewegung. I, his sister, transmuted. A dead man visits you. Out of the hurt sound runs the flash-flooding blue tone in swarthy brows, nixing unsayable eye blinks, dark, ill, becoming. Hakon said never suicide, or held the dark thing back through sound syllabic excess, egress, but she, egregious, brought it close like his crumpled brow, his eyelids kissed it, melancholia blew on branches, tochter, totter, clatter, his nasal whine went up in smoke, her legs uncrossed the box, tears whipped the face, wiped the present, tense to cleanse it, virgin versification as faked transfiguration. The wandering of buzzards, ink-black milkshake, with no cosmic or historic significance, girls drink, grasp the straw, solipsistic slipknot. All right, so this is just going to be just a couple of sections from the very beginning of the book. The street, how it smarts. This one's blank. The nexus sparks. I can't remember. Disinterest is aesthetic. Self-interest is prophetic. Ethics of sidewalks. Furthermore, pathetic. Eyebrows don't lie. Just because the light glows, it doesn't follow that there has to be a metaphor. Perspicuous presentation of my anxiety popsicle. Representation of fad. The words doffed their curves and the meanings fumbled, trembled. Voices behind the door infer places. It's not right, it is flat. Metaphysical placemat. Rhymes punch reasons like sister and brother. The girl was no girl, but she remained invisible. Also, the outer suckled world mugged me. I mean, quick language mugged me. Auto tongue lashing program of the first person I vehicle. Then it bit it. Whips of vagrant shouts. The street goes theory proof. Balking necks. Elbow directions. Urge like a belt. Introduction. This is Victor Trakl. Guten Tag, and this is his sister Greta. Talk, hello. Event. Brother and sister played with colored blocks. Victor built a tower, then he knocked it down. Greta made a low fortress wall or other enclosure. Inside it, she put her blue kid sneaker. It was a speech ribbon. It was of speech. It could kick, if necessary. Georg Trakl. Go on going, go on keeping, keep going on, go keeping on, go on ahead, keep heading on, keep to that heading, keep heading ongoing head keeping, keep keeping head on, keep your head on, or keep means a fortress, a different game, but I hate the idea of games of the language. I do not wish to play. Immunity boosters in the form of syntactic sidesteps, trips, and shuffles. She stepped on some pink gum. It slowed her down. The pavements glinted. Shards of syllables flipped the aspect into something abstract. Don't say it, show it. Greta entailed lines from her eyes' pupils. The radiators her witness gnashes its teeth. Heat around the body, the former paragraph refusing to linger. The end of the page beckons like the tenor's Dichterliebe. Ghost journey across the floral bedroom, uneven handwriting, the temptation of simple reference, inability to stop when you want to. All of this was filched from Luckerl's formulas. Girls more than boys are kleptos. But he said Jews, but the muted particulars keep their own counsel. Flagrant tune-ups, mysterious inklings. I will cease before it wilts. Gear shift, now again, uncanny rigor, repetition's finesse, or the limits of the free. Query, does that mean we get to walk through the park again, notice the things, or only through the book?